The splash echoed across the Willowbrook community pool like a gunshot, followed by the sharp blast of a lifeguard's whistle. Marcus Thompson, 11 years old and glistening with chlorine water, surfaced near the deep end with a wide grin that would vanish in exactly 37 seconds. He treaded water effortlessly, his dark skin gleaming under the afternoon sun as he called out to his friends scattered across the pool deck. "Did you see that dive? I totally nailed it," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying the pure joy that only summer vacation could bring. The cannonball had been perfect, sending a cascade of water over the pool's edge and drawing laughs from the other kids lounging on colorful towels. But not everyone was laughing. From her premium poolside chair, positioned strategically in the shade of an umbrella that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, Karen Whitmore watched the boy with narrowed eyes. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her iced latte as she observed Marcus splash playfully with his friends, all of whom had been coming to the pool together since the season started in June. The Willowbrook Community Pool had been the heart of summer life in this suburban neighborhood for over 20 years. Nestled between manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks, it served as the gathering place where children learned to swim. Teenagers pretended to be too cool while secretly having the time of their lives, and parents caught up on neighborhood gossip while keeping one eye on their offspring. Marcus had been looking forward to this summer more than any other. His family had moved to Willowbrook just before the school year ended, and after months of being the new kid, he had finally found his group. There was Jake, freckled and energetic, whose family had lived in the neighborhood since before Marcus was born. Sarah, quiet but fiercely loyal, who could hold her breath underwater longer than anyone. And twins, Emma and Ethan, whose synchronized swimming attempts always ended in spectacular failures that left everyone in stitches. The Thompson family had worked hard to afford their modest two-story home on Elm Street. Marcus's father, David, was a software engineer who had taken a position with a local tech company specifically so they could move to a neighborhood with better schools. His mother, Angela, taught third grade at the elementary school Marcus would attend in the fall. They had scrimped and saved for years to make the move, drawn by the promise of tree-lined streets, low crime rates, and yes, the community pool that came with their homeowners association membership. But as Marcus pulled himself out of the pool that Tuesday afternoon in July, droplets cascading from his lean frame onto the sun-warmed concrete, he had no idea that his simple presence had been bothering Karen Whitmore for weeks. To her, he was an anomaly that needed to be addressed, a problem that required a solution. Karen rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to being obeyed. At 43, she had perfected the art of looking both overdressed and completely at home in any situation. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a style that managed to look effortless, while clearly requiring significant time and expense to maintain. The tennis outfit she wore had never seen an actual tennis court, but it broadcast her status just as effectively as the designer handbag positioned precisely beside her chair. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the ambient sounds of summer fun with the precision of a blade. "Excuse me, young man." Marcus looked around, water still dripping from his hair, unsure if he was being addressed. When Karen's gaze fixed on him with unmistakable intent, he pointed to himself with a questioning expression. "Yes, I need to speak with you." Karen's tone carried the weight of authority she believed she possessed, honed through years of homeowners association meetings and PTA politics, where her voice had become synonymous with getting things done, regardless of how others felt about her methods. The other children paused in their activities, sensing the shift in atmosphere the way young animals sense an approaching storm. Jake, who had been preparing for his own cannonball, slowly climbed back down the diving board ladder. Sarah stopped mid-stroke in her measured laps, The twins exchanged a glance that spoke of shared unease. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, genuinely confused. He had been careful to follow all the pool rules posted on the bulletin board near the entrance. No running, no diving in the shallow end, no glass containers. He had even made sure to wait the required 30 minutes after eating lunch before getting back in the water. Karen approached with measured steps, her sandals clicking against the concrete with a staccato rhythm that seemed to announce her importance. When she spoke, her voice carried across the pool area, ensuring that everyone present would hear her words. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Do you actually live in this neighborhood?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the carefree atmosphere that had existed just moments before. Marcus blinked, water droplets falling from his eyelashes as he processed what he was being asked. Yes, we live on Elm Street, the blue house with the white fence." His voice carried a note of confusion that any reasonable adult would have recognized as genuine. But Karen Whitmore had not built her reputation on being reasonable. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I know every family that belongs here. I've never seen you before this summer. And frankly, I find it hard to believe that your family just happened to move into one of the most expensive streets in Willowbrook." The implication in her words was as clear as the chlorinated water that surrounded them. Jake stepped forward, his young face flushed with indignation. "Mrs. Whitmore, Marcus lives here. His family bought the Hendersons' old house. Everyone knows that." "I wasn't speaking to you, Jacob," Karen replied with ice in her voice. "And I think it's interesting how quick you are to defend someone who might not even have the right to be using our pool." The word "our" carried special emphasis, delivered with the proprietary tone of someone who viewed the community amenities as personal property rather than shared resources. Other parents around the pool began to take notice, conversations dying as they turned their attention to the unfolding confrontation. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the pool water still dripping from his swim trunks. At 11 years old, he was not naive about the world, but he had hoped that in this new neighborhood, with these new friends, he might be able to simply be a kid without having to navigate the complicated currents of adult prejudice. "My parents have the membership card," he said quietly, his voice smaller now. "They paid the fee just like everyone else." "That's what I'm questioning," Karen shot back, her voice rising. "Pool membership is tied to home ownership in this neighborhood, and I have reason to believe that your family doesn't actually own a home here. For all I know, you could be visiting someone, or worse, just wandering in here because you know we don't check IDs at the gate." The accusation was stunning in its boldness and cruelty. Around the pool, parents began whispering among themselves, some looking uncomfortable with Karen's aggressive questioning, others nodding along with the logic that membership should be verified, even if they privately cringed at the way she was handling the situation. Sarah swam to the pool's edge and pulled herself out, water streaming from her one-piece swimsuit as she positioned herself next to Marcus in a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about her character. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're being really mean. Marcus is our friend, and he belongs here just as much as anybody else." "That's exactly what needs to be determined," Karen replied, her attention never wavering from Marcus. "Young man, I'm going to need you to leave the pool area until you can provide proper documentation that your family has legitimate membership rights." The demand was delivered with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, searching for an adult who might intervene, who might point out the absurdity and cruelty of what was happening. But the adults present seemed frozen, caught between their discomfort with Karen's methods and their uncertainty about how to respond. "I can call my mom," Marcus offered, his voice barely above a whisper. "She can bring the membership stuff." "No. I think it would be better if you just left now," Karen insisted, her voice gaining volume and authority. "If your family truly belongs here, you can sort it out with the homeowners association and come back when you have proper documentation." It was at this moment that Brad Stevens, the head lifeguard, finally approached the situation. At 19, Brad was a college student who had taken the job primarily for the decent pay and the tan it afforded him. He was not equipped to handle complex social situations, and the authority that came with his whistle and elevated chair suddenly felt overwhelming. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping someone would tell him there wasn't. Karen seized the opportunity immediately. "Yes, there is. This child has been using the pool without proper membership verification. As a long-standing member of this community, and someone who pays significant dues to maintain these facilities, I'm requesting that he be removed until his family can provide appropriate documentation." Brad looked between Karen and Marcus, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but uncertain about his authority in such matters. The pool rules he had memorized during his brief training period had covered safety protocols and chemical balance, not disputes over membership legitimacy. Well, I suppose if there's a question about membership," he began hesitantly. "There's no question about membership," Jake interrupted, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Marcus belongs here. His family moved in 3 months ago. Everyone knows this, except Mrs. Whitmore, and she's just being—" "Careful, young man," Karen warned, her eyes flashing. "I won't be spoken to disrespectfully by a child, especially not when I'm trying to ensure the safety and security of our community." The phrase safety and security hung in the air with particular weight, carrying implications that made several adults shift uncomfortably in their pool chairs. Marcus felt the words like a physical blow, understanding on some level that his mere presence was being characterized as a threat. It was then that Karen made her decision to escalate the situation beyond anything a reasonable person might have imagined. She pulled out her smartphone, her manicured fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the screen. 911. What's your emergency?" The voice from the phone was barely audible, but those closest to Karen could hear it clearly. "Yes, I need police response to the Willowbrook Community Pool. We have an individual here who doesn't belong, and when asked to leave, he's refusing to comply. I'm concerned about the safety of the other children." The pool area fell silent, except for the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edges and the distant hum of the filtration system. Even the younger children, who hadn't fully grasped the complexity of the situation, seemed to sense that something had shifted into territory far more serious than a simple disagreement. Marcus felt his legs go weak. At 11 years old, he had never had any interaction with police beyond the friendly officer who visited his school to talk about bicycle safety. The idea that someone had called them because of his presence at a pool where he had every right to be felt surreal, like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. "Ma'am, you can't be serious," said Linda Patterson, a mother of 2 who had been watching the confrontation with growing horror. "He's just a child, and he's done nothing wrong." "He's trespassing on private property," Karen replied firmly, having apparently convinced herself that this characterization was accurate. And when asked to leave, he refused. That makes it a police matter. The next 15 minutes passed in a haze of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Marcus's friends rallied around him, but their support, while emotionally meaningful, felt fragile against the weight of adult authority and the approaching sound of sirens. Other children in the pool area began to leave with their parents, some casting sympathetic looks in Marcus's direction, others simply wanting to avoid being caught up in whatever was unfolding. Officer Daniel Rodriguez arrived with his partner, Officer Jennifer Walsh, both experienced community patrol officers who had been expecting to find a clear-cut case of trespassing or disorderly conduct. Instead, they encountered a scene that made them both immediately uncomfortable. A clearly frightened young boy surrounded by his friends, facing off against a woman whose demeanor suggested she was accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his tone professional but gentle as he assessed the situation. Karen stepped forward immediately, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed she had law enforcement on her side. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. This child has been using our community pool without proper membership verification. When I asked him to leave until he could provide documentation, he refused. I'm concerned about security and the precedent this sets for other unauthorized individuals who might think they can use our facilities." Officer Walsh studied Marcus, taking in his obvious youth and the genuine fear in his eyes. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her, but she knew she needed to gather more information before making any judgments. "Son, what's your name?" she asked Marcus, her voice much gentler than Karen's had been. "Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice barely audible. "And where do you live, Marcus?" 1247 Elm Street. The blue house with the white fence. The address came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he might forget it under pressure. Officer Rodriguez made a note on his pad, then looked at Karen. "Ma'am, have you actually verified whether this family lives at that address?" The question seemed to catch Karen off guard. "Well, no, but I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I know who belongs here. This family just appeared this summer, claiming to have bought a house. But I've never seen any moving trucks or any indication that they're legitimate residents." "So your complaint is based on the fact that you haven't personally observed this family moving in?" Officer Walsh asked, her tone carefully neutral, but with an edge that suggested she was not impressed with the reasoning. "It's based on my knowledge of this community and my responsibility as a long-standing member to ensure that our facilities aren't being used by people who don't have the right to be here," Karen replied, her voice rising slightly as she sensed that the officers were not immediately taking her side. Officer Rodriguez turned back to Marcus. "Son, do your parents have any documentation of your family's membership in this pool?" "Yes, sir. My mom keeps all that stuff in the kitchen. I can call her. Or you could call her. Or I could go get it." Marcus's voice trailed off as he realized he was rambling, his nervousness making it difficult to organize his thoughts. "Why don't you give me your mother's phone number, and I'll give her a call," Officer Walsh suggested, pulling out her own phone. As Marcus recited his mother's number, Karen's expression grew increasingly stern. "Officers, I hope you understand that allowing people to claim membership without immediate verification sets a dangerous precedent. What's to stop anyone from wandering in here and claiming they belong?" "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern," Officer Rodriguez replied, "but we need to follow proper procedures. We can't remove someone from what might be legitimately accessible property without cause." The phone call to Angela Thompson lasted less than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes felt like hours to Marcus, who stood dripping in his swim trunks while adults debated his right to exist in the space where he had been playing happily just an hour earlier. He could hear his mother's voice through the phone, tight with confusion and growing anger as Officer Walsh explained the situation. "Ma'am, your son is fine, but we have a resident here who's questioning your family's membership status. Would it be possible for you to bring some documentation to verify your membership?" Officer Walsh asked. Even from several feet away, Marcus could hear his mother's response, her voice sharp with indignation. "Documentation. We've been members since May. We have the membership cards, the receipt for the annual fee, and the HOA paperwork. Who exactly is questioning our right to be there?" Officer Walsh glanced at Karen, then back at her phone. "A Mrs. Karen Whitmore." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Officer Walsh checked to make sure the call was still connected. When Angela Thompson finally spoke, her voice carried a dangerous calm that anyone who knew her well would have recognized as a warning sign. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." While they waited for Marcus's mother to arrive, the tension at the pool continued to escalate. Karen seemed increasingly agitated that her authority was being questioned, while Marcus's friends formed a protective circle around him, their young faces set with determination that would have been admirable under other circumstances, but felt heartbreaking given the situation. "I want everyone to understand something," Karen announced to the assembled group, her voice carrying across the pool area. "This isn't personal. This is about maintaining standards and ensuring that our community remains safe and exclusive to those who have earned the right to be here." The word "earned" carried particular weight, delivered with an emphasis that made her meaning crystal clear to everyone present. Several parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more troubling than a simple membership dispute. When Angela Thompson's car pulled into the pool parking lot, the sound of her car door slamming carried across the area like a gunshot. She strode toward the pool, with the determined gait of a woman who had been pushed too far, carrying a folder thick with documents and an expression that made several people unconsciously step out of her path. At 38, Angela Thompson was an educator who had spent years dealing with difficult parents, bureaucratic red tape, and the countless small injustices that came with working in public schools. She was not easily intimidated, and she was certainly not going to be intimidated by a woman who had decided to terrorize her son over a swimming pool. "Where is she?" Angela asked Officer Walsh, her voice tight with controlled fury. Karen stepped forward before the officer could respond. "I assume you're this child's mother. I hope you can understand that I was simply trying to verify." "Stop talking," Angela interrupted, her voice cutting through Karen's explanation like a blade. "You called the police on my 11-year-old son for using a pool that he has every right to use. Before you say another word, let me show you exactly how wrong you are." Angela opened her folder with theatrical precision, pulling out documents one by one and handing them to Officer Rodriguez. "Here's our Homeowners Association membership agreement, dated March 15th. Here's the receipt for our annual pool fee, paid in full on April 2nd. Here's our property deed, showing that we purchased 1247 Elm Street on February 28th. Here's our homeowner's insurance policy, showing continuous coverage since our move-in date. And here," she said, pulling out a laminated card, "is our pool membership card with our names clearly printed on it." The documents were passed between the two officers, who examined them carefully, while Karen's face grew increasingly flushed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Thompson family were legitimate residents and pool members, with documentation that was more complete than what most families bothered to maintain. "Ma'am, these documents clearly show that your family has proper membership," Officer Rodriguez said, handing the papers back to Angela. "There's no question about your right to use the pool facilities." Angela turned her attention to Karen, her eyes blazing with an anger that was all the more powerful for being completely justified. "So tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, what exactly made you think that my family didn't belong here? What specific evidence did you have that we were trespassing?" Karen's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find an answer that wouldn't reveal the ugly truth behind her actions. I just hadn't seen your family before. And I thought." "You thought what? Exactly?" Angela pressed, her voice rising. "That black families can't afford to live in this neighborhood. That we must be lying about owning a home here. That my son was somehow dangerous to the other children." The questions hung in the air like accusations, because that's exactly what they were. Around the pool, the remaining adults fell silent as they watched Karen struggle to respond to charges that everyone present now understood to be accurate. "It wasn't about race," Karen protested weakly, but her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Really?" Angela shot back. "Then explain to me why you didn't question any of the other children here today. Explain why you didn't ask Jake for documentation, or Sarah, or any of the other kids who've been playing in this pool all summer. Explain why my son was the only one whose right to be here was questioned." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen looked around desperately for support, but found only uncomfortable faces turning away from her gaze. Even those who might have sympathized with her desire to maintain community standards could not ignore the obvious discriminatory nature of her actions. Officer Walsh stepped forward, her professional demeanor firmly in place, but her displeasure with the situation evident. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you directly. Did you have any evidence whatsoever that this family was not legitimately using the pool? Or was your complaint based solely on assumptions?" The question was a trap, and Karen was smart enough to recognize it. Any answer she gave would either admit to racial profiling or reveal her to be someone who called police without justification. "I was concerned about security," she said finally, her voice smaller than it had been all afternoon. "Security from what exactly?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "An 11-year-old boy swimming with his friends?" As the officers continued their questioning, more residents began to arrive at the pool, drawn by text messages and phone calls describing the unfolding situation. Word travels fast in suburban neighborhoods, especially when it involves police cars and raised voices at the community pool. Among the new arrivals was Tom Henderson, whose family had previously owned the house the Thompsons now lived in. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood what had happened. "Angela! David!" he called out, approaching with his wife. "Carol, we heard there was some kind of trouble down here." David Thompson had arrived shortly after his wife, and the couple now stood together presenting a united front that was both dignified and unmistakably angry. David was a tall man with an easy smile that was notably absent as he surveyed the scene. "Tom, Carol, good to see you," David replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Apparently there's been some question about whether we belong in the neighborhood." Tom Henderson's face darkened as he looked between the Thompsons and Karen Whitmore. "Question about what we sold them our house. They're wonderful people, and anyone who has a problem with them has a problem with us." The public support from the well-established Henderson family shifted the dynamic yet again. Other residents who had been uncertain about how to respond began to speak up, their voices creating a chorus of disapproval directed at Karen's actions. "This is absolutely ridiculous," said Janet Morrison, mother of 2 teenagers, who often swam with Marcus and his friends. "The Thompson family has been nothing but pleasant since they moved in. Marcus is a delightful child, and this whole situation is embarrassing to our entire community. Karen found herself increasingly isolated as more voices joined the criticism. What had started as her attempt to assert authority over community membership had transformed into a public trial of her own character, and she was losing badly. "I think we've heard enough," Officer Walsh announced, closing her notepad with a decisive snap. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to inform you that filing false police reports is a serious matter. You called emergency services claiming trespassing and safety concerns. But the evidence clearly shows that this family has every right to be here." Furthermore, Officer Rodriguez added, "Discriminatory harassment based on race is not only morally wrong, it's potentially illegal. I strongly suggest you consider whether your actions today reflect the kind of community you want to live in." The officer's words carried the weight of official disapproval, making it clear that they viewed Karen's behavior as both inappropriate and potentially criminal. As they prepared to leave, Officer Walsh knelt down to speak with Marcus, who had remained quiet throughout much of the confrontation. "Son, I want you to know that you did nothing wrong today. You have every right to be here, and if anyone bothers you again, you tell your parents and they can call us." "Okay." Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, but his posture straighter than it had been since the ordeal began. The officer's words, coming from a position of clear authority, seemed to lift some of the weight that had settled on his young shoulders. As the police cars pulled away, the confrontation entered a new phase. Karen, now publicly humiliated and officially reprimanded, should have had the good sense to leave quietly and perhaps later attempt some form of apology. Instead, she seemed to interpret the officer's departure as an opportunity to save face. "I want everyone to know that I was only trying to protect this community," she announced to the assembled crowd. "If that makes me the villain in your eyes, then so be it. But someone has to be willing to ask the hard questions and make sure our standards are maintained." The speech was a catastrophic miscalculation. Rather than generating sympathy or understanding, it confirmed everyone's worst suspicions about her motivations and character. "Your standards," Angela Thompson replied, her voice carrying across the pool area with perfect clarity. "Let me tell you about standards. Mrs. Whitmore, a person with standards doesn't terrorize children. A person with standards doesn't call police on 11-year-old boys for swimming. A person with standards doesn't make assumptions about people based on the color of their skin." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Karen's face went through several shades of red as she realized that her attempt to maintain dignity had only made her situation worse. "You're twisting my words," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm repeating your actions," Angela shot back. "Everything that happened here today was witnessed by dozens of people. You can't rewrite history just because you don't like how it makes you look." It was then that Marcus himself finally spoke up, his young voice cutting through the adult arguments with surprising clarity. "I just wanted to swim with my friends," he said, looking directly at Karen. "I wasn't hurting anybody. I followed all the rules. I don't understand why you didn't like me being here." The simple honesty of his statement was more damning than any adult accusation could have been. Here was a child expressing genuine confusion about why his presence had been viewed as a problem, and his innocence highlighted the ugliness of the situation more clearly than any legal brief or psychological analysis. Karen looked at Marcus, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time as an individual child rather than a problem to be solved. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something that could begin to repair the damage she had caused. Instead, She turned and walked away, her designer sandals clicking against the concrete as she retreated to her car with whatever dignity she could manage to salvage. But the story was far from over. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread throughout Willowbrook like wildfire, amplified by social media posts, neighborhood group chats, and the kind of informal communication network that makes suburban communities simultaneously close-knit and claustrophobic. The reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative toward Karen's behavior. Parents who had previously viewed her as merely overbearing now saw her actions in a much darker light. Property values, always a concern in neighborhoods like Willowbrook, became a topic of heated discussion as residents worried about the negative publicity their community was receiving. 3 days after the pool incident, David Thompson received a phone call from Richard Brennan, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. The conversation was brief, but significant. "David, I wanted to call personally to apologize for what happened at the pool," Brennan said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "The board is taking this matter very seriously, and we want to make sure your family knows that Karen Whitmore's actions don't represent the values of our community." "I appreciate that, Richard," David replied, though his tone remained cautious. "But I have to ask, what exactly does taking it seriously mean? Because my son is still afraid to go to the pool, and my wife and I are questioning whether we made the right decision in moving here." The frank admission hit Brennan like a physical blow. The idea that a family might leave the neighborhood because of one resident's bigotry was both morally appalling and practically problematic for property values and community reputation. "We're calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night," Brennan said. "I hope you and Angela will attend. We want to address this situation directly and make sure something like this never happens again." The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center adjacent to the pool, and the turnout was unprecedented. Residents who hadn't attended a board meeting in years showed up, drawn by the gravity of the situation and the community-wide discussion it had generated. Karen Whitmore arrived early, positioning herself near the back of the room with a small group of supporters who had privately expressed sympathy for her concerns about community standards, even if they disapproved of her methods. However, as the room filled up, it became clear that she was significantly outnumbered by residents who viewed her actions as unacceptable. The Thompson family entered together, Marcus walking between his parents with the careful dignity that children sometimes display when they know they're the center of adult attention. They were greeted by warm smiles and supportive words from neighbors who wanted to make clear that they were welcomed and valued members of the community. Richard Brennan called the meeting to order with unusual formality, clearly understanding that the evening's proceedings would be remembered for years to come. "We're here tonight to address a serious incident that occurred at our community pool earlier this week. Before we begin discussion, I want to state clearly that the Willowbrook Homeowners Association condemns any form of discrimination or harassment based on race, and we are committed to ensuring that all residents feel safe and welcome in our community." The statement was met with applause, but Karen's supporters shifted uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to understand how isolated their position had become. Angela Thompson had requested permission to address the board, and when she stood to speak, the room fell completely silent. Her prepared remarks were measured and powerful, delivered with the skill of an experienced educator who knew how to command attention and respect. 3 days ago, my 11-year-old son was humiliated, threatened, and had police called on him for the crime of swimming while black, she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. He was accused of trespassing, of not belonging, of being a potential danger to other children. All of this happened despite the fact that we are legitimate homeowners and pool members who have done nothing but try to integrate peacefully into this community." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "But what happened to Marcus is not just about one child or one family. It's about what kind of community we choose to be. It's about whether we welcome diversity or merely tolerate it. It's about whether our children learn to see differences as something to celebrate or something to fear." The speech continued for several more minutes, touching on themes of community responsibility, shared values, and the importance of standing up against discrimination in all its forms. When Angela finished, the applause was sustained and heartfelt, with many residents rising to their feet in a show of support that left no doubt about where the community's sympathies lay. Several other residents spoke in support of the Thompson family and in condemnation of Karen's actions. Tom Henderson gave a particularly pointed speech about the values he had hoped to see in the neighborhood when he sold his house to the Thompsons. Parents of Marcus's friends spoke about their children's distress at seeing their friend treated so poorly. When Karen was finally given an opportunity to respond, she rose slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. Her prepared remarks seemed to focus on justifying her actions rather than apologizing for them. "I want everyone to understand that I never intended for this situation to escalate the way it did," she began, her voice defensive. "I was simply trying to verify membership status, which I believe is a reasonable concern for community security." The explanation was met with murmurs of disapproval from the audience. Several people shook their heads, clearly unconvinced by her rationalization. Furthermore, Karen continued, apparently unable to read the room's hostile mood, "I think we need to be careful about rushing to judgment based on accusations of racism. I have many friends of different backgrounds, and I resent the implication that my concerns were motivated by prejudice." The response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Several residents stood up to challenge her claims, pointing out the obvious discriminatory nature of her behavior and the harm she had caused to both Marcus and the community's reputation. It was Marcus himself who provided the evening's most powerful moment. When asked if he wanted to say anything to the assembled residents, he stood up with the careful consideration of someone who understood the importance of his words. "I like living here," he said, his young voice clear and steady. "I like my friends, and I like swimming at the pool. I don't want to move away, but I also don't want to be scared every time I go somewhere that someone might call the police on me again." He paused, looking directly at Karen across the room. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't understand why you didn't like me, but I hope maybe we can be neighbors without being mean to each other." The grace and maturity displayed by an 11-year-old child facing the adult who had terrorized him was stunning. Several people in the audience wiped away tears, while others shook their heads in amazement at Marcus's ability to offer reconciliation even after what he had endured. Karen's response to this moment of grace would be remembered as the final nail in the coffin of her standing in the community. Instead of accepting the olive branch offered by a child, she chose to double down on her original position. "I appreciate the sentiment," she said stiffly, "but I still believe that community standards must be maintained, and I would do the same thing again if faced with similar circumstances." The collective gasp that arose from the audience was audible. Karen had just publicly stated that she would repeat her discriminatory behavior, eliminating any possibility that her actions could be dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment. Richard Brennan's response was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Whitmore, based on your statement tonight and your actions earlier this week, the board is prepared to take formal action, effective immediately. Your pool privileges are suspended pending a full investigation of this incident." The announcement was met with applause, but Brennan wasn't finished. Furthermore, we will be reviewing your continued membership in the Homeowners Association Board, as your behavior is incompatible with the values we strive to uphold in this community. The formal sanctions against Karen were just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, a deeper investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had previously been overlooked or dismissed. Several other residents came forward with stories of Karen's inappropriate comments and actions toward people of color, immigrants, and anyone else she deemed not quite suitable for Willowbrook. The most damaging revelation came from the pool's security camera footage, which had captured the entire incident in digital clarity. The video showed Karen's aggressive approach to Marcus, her obvious targeting of him while ignoring other children, and her escalation of a non-existent problem into a police matter. When portions of the footage were shared on social media, the response was swift and devastating to Karen's reputation. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of the kind of racial profiling that continued to plague American communities. The coverage was generally sympathetic to Marcus and his family, while portraying Karen as the embodiment of suburban prejudice and entitlement. The publicity had unexpected consequences for the Willowbrook community as a whole. Property values, initially feared to decline because of negative attention, actually remained stable as the community's response to the incident was viewed favorably by potential homebuyers who valued diversity and inclusivity. More importantly, the incident sparked a broader conversation within Willowbrook about unconscious bias, community standards, and what it truly meant to welcome new residents. The HOA board implemented new policies designed to prevent discriminatory behavior and established a community committee focused on promoting inclusion and understanding. Karen Whitmore's membership in the Homeowners Association was ultimately revoked, a decision that was upheld even after she threatened legal action. Her pool privileges were permanently suspended, and she found herself increasingly isolated within the community she had once dominated through force of personality and social positioning. The most satisfying element of the resolution came in the form of a gesture from the HOA board toward the Thompson family. In recognition of the trauma Marcus had endured, and as a symbol of the community's commitment to inclusion, the board voted to provide the Thompson family with a complimentary pool membership for the following year, along with guest privileges that would allow them to bring friends and extended family to enjoy the facilities. More meaningfully, the community organized a unity pool party later that summer, specifically designed to celebrate diversity and inclusion. Marcus was asked to serve as the honorary host, a role he accepted with the same grace he had shown throughout the ordeal. The party was attended by nearly the entire neighborhood and became an annual tradition that would continue for years to come. As summer wound down and the new school year approached, Marcus had not only reclaimed his place at the community pool, but had become something of a local hero. His friends remained fiercely loyal, his family had been embraced by the broader community, and he had learned lessons about courage, dignity, and standing up for what's right that would serve him throughout his life. The incident at the Willowbrook Community Pool became a defining moment for the entire neighborhood. It forced residents to examine their own biases, consider their responsibilities as community members, and ultimately choose the kind of place they wanted to live in. The choice they made, overwhelmingly and decisively, was to stand with inclusion, justice, and the simple principle that all children deserve to swim freely and safely in their community pool. On the last day of summer vacation, Marcus stood at the edge of the diving board, looking out over the clear blue water that had become the site of both his greatest challenge and his greatest triumph. His friends were scattered around the pool, calling encouragement as they had done so many times before. But this time was different. because this time he knew with absolute certainty that he belonged here. The dive was perfect, sending up a cascade of droplets that caught the late afternoon sun like diamonds. When Marcus surfaced, he was grinning with the pure joy that had been temporarily stolen from him, but had now returned stronger than ever. Around the pool, other children played and laughed, their voices creating the soundtrack of a summer that had changed everything and everyone it touched. Karen Whitmore watched from her kitchen window across the street, a lonely figure who had chosen isolation over growth, prejudice over understanding. The community had moved on without her, creating something better and more beautiful than what had existed before. Sometimes the most important victories are won not through conquest, but through the simple act of choosing to be better than those who would diminish us. The summer that changed everything had come to an end, but its lessons would echo through the Willowbrook community for generations to come. In the end, it wasn't just about a boy's right to swim, but about the kind of people we choose to be when faced with the opportunity to do what's right. The community had passed that test, and in doing so, had created a legacy of inclusion and justice that would welcome countless families in the years to come. Marcus Thompson dove again, and the splash echoed across the pool like a celebration, a sound of pure joy that proclaimed to anyone who might be listening that he was exactly where he belonged.